Hey, what's up everybody? It's Joe from Gadgetry Tech, and in today's video I'm going to talk about two new headphones from FiiO. And depending on when you're watching this won't be the latest one they just released because they have more headphones coming up that I tried at CanJam recently that I'm really excited to talk about, mainly on the budget side of things. But these are definitely not on the budget side. So to my right, your left, is the FiiO FT7. This is an open back planar magnetic headphone with a retail price of $700. They also recently came out with the FiiO FT13, which is a closed back dynamic driver headphone, and it sells for $330. And I know what you're thinking. These model numbers make no sense. To put that in perspective, we have the FiiO FT1, which is a closed back dynamic driver headphone for less than $200. And then they have the FT1 Pro, which is an open back planar magnetic. So different driver, and it's an open chassis versus a closed. And this guy's going for just over $200 now, thanks to some tariffs, at least in the United States. The older model is the FT3, which was available in a couple different impedances. This is an open back dynamic driver headphone. Then you have the FT5, which is an open back planar magnetic headphone. The FT7 is their flagship. It is an open back planar, as I said. And then oddly enough, we just jumped straight to FT13, which is a closed back dynamic that's supposed to be like a slightly better version of the FT1. But is it? So let's start with what's included. And on the FT13, you have an upgraded case. The FT1 is still nice to even come with the case at this price. It still sells for less than $200. And honestly, for the sound quality and looks and having a rich accessory pack like this, you got two different cables, which use like a shoelace style sleeve on the cable itself. Didn't help with microphonics, but microphonics thankfully isn't terrible on the FT1. So looking at the FT13, the case is a little bit more robust looking. It just looks a little bit nicer. The presentation is comparable, but obviously a little bit more put together. You have this cable upgrade, which to me is the best thing about the FT13. I absolutely love this cable. And frankly, if they sold this separately, I think this is a really good cable for a huge variety of headphones out there. It uses a dual 3.5mm TS sleeve terminal, a little bit thicker, so I wouldn't expect this to work on the Meze audio products that have the recessed terminal. But for things like hifi and obviously many other FiiO products, the AU and AR5000, for example, all of those headphones use a dual 3.5, and something like this is a great cable for that. So on one end is the balanced termination. There's a little sleeve here that I can unscrew and pull this off and change it in case I want to go to single-ended and go with a dual. I can show you a 3.5mm right here. So, and then it'll come with a 1/4-inch adapter. So relatively straightforward. And to put it in, there's a little slot right here to kind of line it up. So I'm going to double check where that one is on this. And there's even an arrow that points to where that slot is. So it's just a matter of lining up the pins, pushing it back in, and then we're going to lock the collar back. It's a little bit on the larger side, but this isn't really meant to be a portable headphone, so not the end of the world. Either way, I love the looks, I love the length, and because this is like a rubber sleeve on the end, it doesn't have any microphonics issues either, which is super important on a closed back headphone. Now this also comes with two different sets of pads. The default pads are these leatherette ones, which are a little bit on the thinner side, and they use a different mounting mechanism. So I put the suede ones on here because one, it's hilarious what it does to the sound, but also I just love the feeling of suede. I think it's very comfortable. One thing that's worth pointing out is that gorgeous grill. So let's just remove a pad and show you how easy it is. There's these little clips that kind of hold it in place. That baffle is absolutely stunning. We're gonna open the baffle up on a FiiO FT1. Again, this is a closed back too, and this uses a more traditional rubber, so very easy to put on and off. And you can see a, similar idea, different shape on the actual cutout itself, whereas the FT13 is rounded. It still uses that like acoustic screen material, like a silk screen type material, which is obviously used for tuning. But it's just a little bit more flashy looking. One thing that is worth pointing out though is both of these variants, regardless of the material choice, has a slightly larger opening than the older FT1. The FT1 has this nice little screen on the top, which covers the driver, which will help keep it clean. But obviously with the FT13, they wanted to show that off a little bit because it's using a new driver. This new driver has slightly different specs than the FT1, but overall it's still very easy to drive. And honestly, like, just because it has new driver material doesn't mean it's better. It never guarantees anything. It's just a different material. And ultimately, the goal of the driver cone material is to be incredibly stiff and light, because if it's stiff, you're not going to have as much distortion issues to deal with. And if it's light, it's going to let the motor structure do what it wants. So that's always kind of a goal. And I put this on wrong. So normally with the rubber ones, you can just like circle it around and kind of lock it in place. With this guy, there is a label. So I was like way off because I wasn't paying attention. You can see it says R, and on the inside of the pad, it says R. The trick is just to get the two R's to mirror each other. And once you do that, you can put it into place. Normally, I'm not a fan of a proprietary mounting mechanism. I'm not justifying it in any way, but one thing that's really nice about it is your pad is lined up to the direction or design choice of FiiO, because there is a little bit of an angle here on the cup itself. Now, there are more changes with the FT13 as well, and partly due to the chassis. So you can see a more premium stitch. It's a similar pad material on the top. It feels a little bit more plush on the FT13, but overall very similar. On the inside, you have these like little suede nuggets, if you will, but the padding is relatively thin. Honestly, it's very easy to bottom out and feel the metal headband. On this guy, the padding is solid all the way around, but it too isn't like crazy thick padding, and it's not a suspension strap either. It's a spring steel headband inside. And then of course you have telescoping yokes here that rotate and tilt in and out, which if you hear this, that is a hard stop. You go to this guy, it doesn't have like the hard stop bottoming out thing. But what's interesting is this hinge design had some discussions early on because there were a couple rounds of some quality control issues, which they eventually fixed. Thankfully, mine never had that issue, but the geometry is going to be a huge talking point with this headphone, because I think this is like the biggest make or break even before we get into sound quality. So FiiO has usually had really good sizing options for me. They've always fit my head really well. Padding aside, the FT1 I feel like there's wiggle room for slightly smaller heads than mine and slightly larger. The FiiO FT13 had two issues for me. On the smallest setting, when I'm not wearing a hat, it's still too big. It hangs at the top of my ears just a little bit and it drops the pad down. And you can get away with it a little bit on an open back headphone, but with a closed back, a seal is critically important for bass performance. And as soon as you break that seal, it definitely changes the sound. You lose a lot of the bass, and sometimes it can affect the mid-range as well, but it will, because it removes so much bass, make it sound kind of bright and harsh. The other issue, if you remember me showing you this like hinge part where it was kind of bottoming out against the yoke, they didn't angle this enough personally, in my opinion, because what happens is when I open this up, I need this to like, if you see it when it's this wide, I can't tilt the pads in. Now this is extreme, so depending on your head shape, this is going to vary a lot. But as soon as you get to this sweet spot, I need it to kick in just a little bit more. This angle right here, if they angled it slightly more so this whole fork was tilted in a little bit, it would help put a little bit more bottom pressure behind my ear. Unfortunately, it doesn't. And as a result, even when we get into frequency response later on a flat plate measurement device, this will look like it has more bass, or at least it can, because it's reliant on that seal. In real life, I get less bass on the FT13 than my FT1 just because I can literally get my finger behind my ear between the pad and my skin. It's that big of a gap. So this is going to vary greatly. If you have a taller head that is relatively slender, I think this could fit you really well. If you have a really wide head or a smaller head, I don't think this geometry is flexible as their less expensive FT1 chassis design. Now, it's a wildly different ownership experience with the FT7. One, for price, and two, the overall design and feel. So this uses carbon fiber on the headband, and it's much lighter in design overall than using a larger amount of metals like spring steel or aluminum. You have a metal fork here, so that feels very premium and solid. You can see carbon fiber on the outer edge of the ear cup material, and then this is a zebra wood baffle or like outer cup, which you can kind of see the driver structure inside. It's a beautiful driver. This is a huge 106 millimeter planar magnetic driver, and that will affect the way it behaves later. So it's worth pointing out. Counter to the FT13, the ergonomics of the FT7 is exceptional. It has such a wide variance of adjustability. You have a telescoping suspension strap on here, which doesn't feel crazy smooth. It's a little notchy and there's no way to lock it in. I prefer how smooth something like the Meze Audio headphones are. It just seems to be a nicer glide material. But with this design, it fits a huge variety of heads. I'm kind of like a couple notches up on both sides, and I have a perfect placement on my head. So regardless of your head shape, the FT7 is going to have a much wider tolerance there. This use of suspension strap and more exotic materials also helps keep weight down. And if you're familiar what typical weights are of a big old planar magnetic headphone, they get up there like 500 to 700 grams in weight. They kept this at just over 400 grams, which is pretty remarkable considering the size of the driver and the magnet structure. Like the FT13, you get a very nice looking premium case, effectively the exact same case, and on the inside, the presentation is basically the same as well. So they're not reinventing the wheel here, it's just cut a little bit differently to fit this particular headphone. And you also get 2 sets of pads and a pretty insane cable. So these are lambskin pads. They're not leatherette, and on this price range, it makes sense because you typically expect better material choices, and that kind of goes in line with the use of zebra wood and carbon fiber and all that. The lambskin has perforations on the inside and the outside. This is used for bass control and tuning characteristics. It also helps with some breathability, but overall that's intentional on the sound side. Now, this is going to be a controversial cable because of a couple reasons. One, it's crazy long. Now this looks and feels like a very high-end cable, but it's a little bit stiff. So if you are just the type of person that wants a good cable but sits at your desk all the time, if you're using it for during the day, honestly, I think the FT13 cable is a nicer daily driver. I have been using this cable for both headphones over this guy. Now, even with that being said, this is a really nice cable. They use really good materials inside, and they talk about their process of building the cable. And of course, you get this whole adapter. Now, this one does not have, interestingly enough, a removable terminal. This is a fixed 4.4 balance connection only, and then it comes with a 4.4 to XLR cable. As bulky as this is, I actually love this design because it's super quick for me to switch for different amps, and it's not a piece. I don't have to keep like a little piece somewhere in a little adapter. This little guy works on a lot of different headphones that come with a 4.4 connection, so I can get by with just one. So it's a different accessory approach, and of course you have the cloth pads as well. I mentioned this before, being that it had 2 pads. Also some perforations on the inside. Now this, believe it or not, uses the same exact pad mounting mechanism as the FT13. These are both unique in this way. And again, it's the same idea where you kind of just line it up. I did pad swap both pads against each other and measured it. And I don't recommend switching pads. There's really no benefit to getting FT13 pads for the FT7 or vice versa. With the pads off, you can see just how large that driver is. And I think this does play into a part of how you perceive and hear sound, because it's not just frequency response. The frequencies are coming from a larger surface area. And as a result, I feel like this is the first thing that segues into sound because it just throws notes around a little bit wider around you. It doesn't feel as centered in your ear. Okay, so let's get into sound quality and start with the objective / measurement side first. And this is my rig measuring this. It's a KB006X Pentachrome. I use flat plates with ears for left and right. And I say all this because you can't compare my measurements to someone else's measurements because one, they don't have the exact same rig or mic or even testing methodology. I do multiple seatings and positional variants to get an average of what this rig's real world expectations would be. But don't compare my rig against someone's B&K 5128, a $40,000 measuring rig. They hear a little bit differently, and this target that is behind the frequency response is the diffuse field target for my specific rig, the HRTF of my rig. So anyway, in simple sense, if you want to see how this measurement compares against other headphones, I've measured over 100. I'm probably pushing 200 headphones now, so I'll have a link in the description below so you can compare this against the frequency response of other headphones you might be interested in. With that being said, let's take a look at the FT13, and these are with both pads. The green line represents the suede pad, which unlocks a ridiculous amount of bass that goes all the way into the mid bass, all the way up to 200 hertz and above. And then the leatherette pads, which is a more natural tuning to me. But keep in mind, I talked about the lack of seal earlier. I don't get the same level of sub bass that is shown on this measurements. Overall, the voicing is quite good, which I was expecting because FiiO's FT1 changed the game for the price and even beyond the price, because honestly, there are $1,000 up headphones that sound pretty bad in comparison to the much less expensive FT1. And that's the red line, which for the colorblind, I will switch, and we have a pale yellow. Let's go with purple, and I hope that's different enough. So comparatively to the FT1, you can see it kind of splits both pad options on the FT13 in the bass department. It's a little bit more forward, and it does sound slightly more forward at 2000 hertz on the FT1, but it's not by much. It can be a little hot there for some who are sensitive to that region, but overall it's not a super shouty headphone. The biggest difference with the FT13 versus the FT1 is this area here where you go from like 3000 hertz to 6000 hertz. There's a little bit of a dip closer to 4K. The dip is bigger on the FT13, but it's met with a higher follow-up response at 5 to 6000 hertz. It really picks up. And depending on what you're listening to, what track, it can kind of add a little extra sparkle or lispiness to it. Basically, if there's a sibilant S on certain tracks, this isn't going to do that any favors. It's not terrible, but because you can see it's not much higher, it's just definitely the most noticeable thing. It's also followed by more high treble as a whole. You can see more energy at 8000 hertz on the FT1, but everything above 10,000 hertz, there's just a little bit more air on the FT13, which some people want, especially if you are less sensitive to higher frequencies. You might find the FT13 to be a much more enjoyable headphone because it's breathing in a little bit more air up top, and it might make it sound like a little bit more opened, and perceptually speaking, it might come across as more detailed. Now, I left the FT13's frequency response up for a quick comparison, and when we look at the FT7, it's obviously going to be quite different. Now, the bass difference on the rig is more dramatic than what I hear on my head, and planar magnetics, a big planar like this, is going to have gobs of sub bass, and that is how I experienced it on my head at least. So there is a little bit more bass for sure on the FT13, especially with those crazy suede pads, which gets even more aggressive. But when you look at the mid-range, both of them between like 300 hertz and 1000 hertz, it's pretty comparable. The FT7 has a little bit more of a lift at 1000 hertz. It's not much, and to me, it doesn't negatively hurt the sound or negatively impact the sound. It's kind of like what Focal does, where you get a little bit of a bump at 1K, and it can make things sound a little bit more dynamic and energetic because of that. What I really like about the FT7 is when you get into the higher frequency response, it has a comparable lift at 3000 hertz, but it's noticeably more relaxed between 4 and 6K. And to me, this is huge because it's very enjoyable in that area. I don't have a sneaky S coming up and, hurting my ears. It does still have an emphasized higher frequency, just like the FT7, or sorry, the FT13. See, the numbers are confusing. They are both leaning towards a little bit more clinical, brighter sound when you compare it to their other models. Now, even if I looked at like the FT1 Pro, which is their budget planar magnetic headphone, let's change the color real quick. And we're going to get rid of the FT7. So these are both planar magnetic open backs from FiiO. The FT7 has a really linear bass response, but this is kind of like an average here. I think in your head, or on your head when you actually listen to it, the larger driver just sounds a bit more impactful and noticeably more clear. You have a big change here at 1 to 2000 hertz where it's definitely more forward on the FT7, and I do prefer the FT7's voicing again overall. It's also not as hot at 3000 hertz, and it's more relaxed again at 5 to 6K, at least comparatively speaking. But again, just like when we looked at the FT1 versus the FT13, both closebacks, this model lifted the high treble. The FT7 compared to the FT1 Pro does a similar thing about 12,000 hertz. That's kind of the area that jumped out to me, is it's a little bit spicy in that, to me, this is still like a high treble area. 12,000 hertz is very bright. And this will vary based off your hearing health, but depending on what you're listening to, you might have cymbals have a little bit longer decay, for example. Just the snappiness of hi-hats and all of these high frequency metallic instruments will noticeably be more strong on this compared to a lot of other headphones out there that don't have that same emphasis. So I'm actually not going to spend too much time on the FT13 for subjective sound quality, and it's really just because, one, if you haven't watched the other chapters of this video, I do suggest checking out the parts of the FT13 because this will make more sense. Not having a seal on my head is a huge no-fly zone for me because I'm not getting the true potential of the headphone. So on the FT13, I kind of had to push in on the back of the cups just to get a proper seal to actually hear the bass that this headphone was capable of delivering. The bass is exceptional. FiiO has had excellent bass delivery on the budget side, so I'm pleased to see that if I had a seal, I can get that same bass delivery. Things get a bit wonky in the upper mids and high treble, or upper mids to high treble, because it sounds a little bit less coherent than the FT1. Everything seems more strung together, and more cohesive with the FT1. Even if it sounds a bit less resolving and a bit less detailed, I get less distractions with what I'm listening to. Now, if you're sensitive to that whole 2 to 3K area and you don't like anything sounding remotely shouty, I don't think this is a shouty headphone, but it can skirt the line for some in that area, whereas this doesn't. Where this one differs is when you get into that whole 6,000 hertz area and that snappy metallic sound that it has. It has a really interesting and somewhat negative effect to the sound. Even the bump at like 1,000 hertz, the way this is voiced, this is going to sound super negative, but I'm just really trying to explain this because I listen to a lot of different music and I listen to a lot of EDM. This tuning does not play well with synths for EDM music. It almost added like a mosquito-like buzzing sensation or like timbre to it that I haven't really heard synths do before, synthesizers. So between the bass seal issue and even with EDM, which is a little bit less sensitive to tonality and timbre, I didn't like the presentation that much. I just have a handful of other headphones, FiiO included, that I would rather listen to it for. And I don't want to seek out specific genres or tracks where this particular one could sound amazing. In a nutshell, if you can get a seal and you're better off doing or okay with doing some EQ, I think the potential is there to be better than the FT1 just because it is a more resolving headphone. And when I tried EQing these to have a similar sound signature, I do hear better subtle detail retrieval of the FT13. So that is kind of nice. Obviously you get the build quality and this exceptional cable. So there are some value points there for what you're paying for, but purely from a sound quality perspective, out of the box, just putting it on and going, I'd still rather just use the FT1. So things get much more difficult to compare against when you look at the FT7, but honestly, this is gonna stack up much more favorably for FiiO here because there's pros and cons to a lot of different models, both above and below this price range. Now, I know hifi just released a slew of new open back planar magnetic headphones and a closed back that shall remain nameless. And I will be covering those in a future review. So instead of just overcomplicating this, I'm going to start with these first, and then when the hifi headphones drop, I'll talk about those headphones and then still include the FiiO FT7 because I think this is one of the better sub $1,000 open back planar magnetic headphones on the market. So you will soon see why. So looking at the hifi Ananda Nano, which is a really good headphone because they got an improved headband design, in my opinion, over the Edition XS. I think the Edition XS sound-wise is such an exceptional headphone, and at that price range, it really is like the pinnacle of value for sub 500 because you can get it for like less than 300 sometimes. The big thing that stands out with this, the first thing I notice is when you put the FT7 on, everything feels perfect. It has just the right amount of clamp versus the weight, the breathability. It feels awesome on my head. The Ananda Nano is still very comfortable thanks to the suspension strap, but it's noticeably more clampy and the pads are a little bit more stiff. So it's not the end of the world. I didn't really dislike the comfort, but if you are sensitive to clamp force, it's very easy to favor the FT7 here. Now, the Ananda Nano, it has a more emphasized mid-bass region, and it shows up in the frequency response and what I hear when I listen to it. If you listen to a lot of like bass guitar music or something that has like a droning bass sensation, the Ananda Nano has a more visceral bass presentation in that area, so you'll feel it kind of vibrate your head a little bit more. The voicing on this is nice. It's bright, but it's like smoothly bright to an extent that there's no major dips followed by a strong peak. It's just bright as a whole, so it's quite easy to EQ. This one has a little bit more relaxed mid-range when I say this, the FiiO FT7, and to me, it's a slightly smoother listen. The one thing that stands out with the Ananda Nano is certain songs can sound absolutely incredible and the imaging is dead center when the track is supposed to be, whereas the FiiO FT7 always likes to sound just a little bit wider and kind of dance around your head a little bit more. But what I favor the FT7 for is the smoothness of the treble. The hifi Ananda Nano has a slightly grainy treble to it. It's not like it's overly harsh, but it's just a little abrasive sounding to an extent. It's really minor, but when you start A/Bing against a lot of other headphones, there are certain songs where this sounds like a little bit more metallic and kind of like overly edgy sounding, whereas I really appreciate the balance that FiiO's navigated here with technical capability and detail retrieval without being over the top. Now, even though this doesn't have the same like mid-bass emphasis that the Ananda Nano does, it's still a really good mid-bass delivery. It's very smooth, very, I guess, easy to listen to and consume because it's not like overly bombarding you with bass notes. But when there is a subtle sub-bass delivery to it, like a thump if you're watching a movie, it just has such an effortless presentation of that. And that is a huge redeeming quality for me in the bass department. This doesn't have, it's not a bass monster, but the bass you get, the detail in the bass you get is exceptional on the FT7. I feel like you get a much clearer separation of notes with bass, whereas some headphones tend to kind of compress it together and be a little bit more one-dimensional. That's not the case with the FT7. I also think pianos have a little bit more weight on the FT7, which I really enjoy because when I do bounce around with a lot of different genres, that's such a pleasing listen. So overall, I think the Ananda Nano for the price is exceptional. I think there's a slight edge here because one, the comfort is better on the FT7, and I think being slightly smoother in the treble to me is better for long-term listening. It might not have the same wow factor up front as the Ananda Nano, which really is impressive, but as you listen to a wide variety of music, I think the FT7 is just going to keep giving you those smiles. The PARO 2 is an interesting listen on the mid-range because it's much more relaxed. There is a coloration at 1000 hertz that I'm not a fan of. It kind of adds a slightly nasally pinched sensation to a lot of vocals, but the frequencies beyond that are more relaxed sounding. So if you can fix the 1 kilohertz bump or the 1 kilohertz bump doesn't bother you, this is a very smooth, easy to listen headphone that also happens to take EQ really well if you want to push the limits on the bass side. This also doesn't have as much of a modal issue on the driver, so it has a very consistent frequency response from driver to driver. Anytime you get into massive drivers like the FT7, the i5 in particular is more noticeable in that from FiiO audio, which I'll talk about. You can get like inconsistent frequency response, and that's not the case with the PARO 2. So that is a really nice quality about this headphone. I think, again, just like the PARO 1, the biggest issue I've had is the chassis design overall. Not a bad headphone, but to me, as far as using it every day, I'd still, again, lean towards the FT7. Now, the FiiO i5 is an interesting headphone because I reviewed this a while back. They had a very different tuning characteristic to them because these are Velcro attached pads, and as a result, there wasn't a great seal right here around the driver. So this is the upgraded mod ring version of the plate. They sent me replaceable replacement covers to go around the driver, and that created a better bass seal. It did improve the sub-bass delivery quite a bit, but because it now coupled the headphone to my head, I lost the mid-bass lift that added some warmth to guitars. So you might like the original sound of the i5 if you're more of the acoustic listener. The stock version that didn't come with the tuning ring was better. This thing has an exceptional amount of modal issues with the driver, and if you look at the frequency response, it's kind of all over the place. And when you get with drivers this large that have this kind of modal issue, it will vary from headphone to headphone. So it has a colored sound. It sounds much better than it measures. I'm not going to say that measurements are everything here, because when I heard this at the show, the reason why I reviewed this is because I actually really liked what I heard at the show. This is a darker mid-range presentation. There's definitely some coloration on this headphone, and it's one of those things where that coloration might, the stars align type of thing. So you might have certain tracks where you like it more. This has massive pads. I mean, they are so deep and they're very cushiony. It clamps a little bit more and it's a little bit heavier. So if you're sensitive to clamp, again, the FiiO FT7, they did a great job there. This is one of those headphones where I wouldn't recommend it as your only headphone, but if you want something that's kind of wildly different, it might be worth checking out. I just think it's outclassed overall with the FT7 because it's just a more polished product in general between the chassis and the sound. Now, just to quickly touch on a few other FiiO models. So the FT1 Pro has a pretty awesome tuning out of the box. I think the forwardness at 3000 hertz is the biggest point of contention and something that I wasn't as crazy about in my review. And I also don't like how thin the headband padding is up top, considering how heavy the driver cups are, or like the cups themselves, because of the planar driver. So the capper strap was like a required upgrade for me in terms of comfort. However, overall from a daily driver standpoint, the sound quality is just exceptional, and I preferred it over the HiFiMan Sundara. The biggest difference with this guy is if they have the same EQ profile to sound identical to each other, at least from a measured frequency response standpoint, I think the FT7 just has a much better handling on low distortion and overall micro details. So if you want a more analytical listen, that's the most clear upgrade. Everything just sounds more resolving on the FT7. And even if you don't do EQ, if you're okay with a slightly brighter air region, like 10,000 hertz and up as a whole, I think the FT7 is a clear upgrade in that regard. Whereas this is kind of a safer sound profile, but Also a little bit less, you know, resolving, I guess. Everything sounds a little bit smoothed over. Then you have the FT3, which is now under $200. So it's worth discussing because the voicing of the FT3 is actually quite good. This is the high impedance model, but this is also really comfortable. The ear pads are on the smaller side and the included cable isn't great, but I like the suspension strap more than what I got with the FT1 and FT1 Pro. The voicing with this guy, what's interesting, it's warmer in the mid bass, and then it still has a nice clean timbre or mid-range presentation. It sounds quite natural. The 10 kilohertz peak is the most noticeable issue with this. So every now and then the wrong note hits and it's like cloyingly bright in that area. So if you can do EQ and notch out 10,000 hertz, at least on my head, it was like 10,500, it becomes an easier listen. The issue is the FT1 is just so good as a closeback, or even the FT1 Pro, that it's kind of harder to justify the FT3 nowadays. Because again, if you're doing the cable upgrade and all that, the included cable is not great. So it gets a little convoluted because their new stuff is just so good. The FT5 is even further crazy in that regard because the tuning of this is not great. It's very, very thick in the mid bass and low mid range, followed by a huge recess in the treble, low treble. And as a result, this just has a huge coloration on everything you listen to. It sounds kind of thick and boxy, and it can sound a little bit muddy. This handles EQ really well, and I think this headphone is so comfortable to wear. I love the way it feels, especially with the suede pad. But when you do EQ, it really turns it into a whole new headphone, and it's much more enjoyable. The biggest issue I have with the FT5 right now is the current price, because it's still selling for $500. And if you could spend $500, I strongly recommend saving up for $700 to get the FT7 if you want a FiiO product, because the tuning of this is much better out of the box. It sounds more natural, but the driver performance is exceptional. So if you are doing EQ or not, you just hear so much more subtle stuff in your mix, and it just sounds like a much more expensive headphone. This doesn't sound bad, but this sounds like it's a much better value at $700 than this does at $500, and I think you just get more for your dollar in addition to everything else. So gaming performance, I know I'm going to get asked on that, and I am working on some roundups and guides because unfortunately there's like new headphones coming out every few weeks, so it's really hard to keep up with everything. I've really enjoyed the FT7 for gaming. The sound signature is excellent. I think the mid-bass lift in the hifi Ananda Nano is better. So I like the bass presentation for gaming more on the Ananda Nano, but I like the slightly smoother treble of the FT7. So it kind of depends. You're EQing different things if either one is an issue for you, but they are very comparable to each other. I do want to give the edge if you can do EQ. I think the Ananda Nano to me was just a little bit tighter on imaging performance. If you are buying a $600 headphone or $500 headphone solely for gaming and FPS stuff, I think the Ananda Nano had a slight edge, but only after I did some EQ to tame the treble. If I just had to put it on in game, I'd still much rather be using the FT7. I'm not a super fan of these guys for gaming simply because they're just outclassed by other headphones here. So just to quickly touch on this, I don't mind the FT1 Pro. It has good enough tuning for gaming. To me, it didn't really have any faults. I just love gaming on the FT1, frankly. I think the sound signature, it has like the right amount of bass to be immersive and fun, but it's not so thick and boomy sounding that it like is taking away from hearing things that I care about, like footsteps or pinpointing things. On the immersive side, it's just phenomenal. If anything, even though this is one of the least expensive ones here, it's probably one of my favorites for immersive gaming. And when I say one of, I'm looking at it and trying to find any reason to consider otherwise. I mean, this guy's more clear and more open, but there is something special about the bass that the FT1 delivers. Now, the FT13 has a lot of potential. If you can have a seal, it really was great. And when I played Call of Duty, even with the suede pads that has that thick mid bass, because I didn't have a seal, it bled off the sub bass, and that to me actually helped with the overall sound signature for first person shooters. So that design flaw, if anything, was working in its favor for FPS games, but that's kind of a really unique situation of where that would be a benefit. I think honestly, it really goes down to the older FT1. the FT7 and the Ananda Nano for my top picks for gaming for their own reasons and prices. And that wraps up my very long-winded review of these two headphones that are wildly different from each other, both in price and performance, and frankly, experience. So to sum it all up, I think the FT7 is worthy of their flagship designation, even though the number doesn't suggest that. I think the comfort and overall sound quality is one of FiiO's best releases yet, followed closely by the FiiO FT1, the OG $150 and now $160 dynamic headphone, which is still exceptional for the money. So I'm pleased to see FiiO is making some really good stuff here that's still very competitive in a very crowded space at that price range. The FT13, just honestly, if the chassis design alone was tweaked, would be ranked much higher for me, but this could be a big issue for a lot of people. And when you add that to the 6,000 hertz lift in the treble, it can have kind of an inconsistent or disjointed presentation, frankly. So the problem is this wasn't really a terrible headphone. It's not bad, but the FT1 is, to me, a slightly better headphone overall for the experience, and it's significantly less money. So not as much of a fan at this guy, but I hope that after watching this, you kind of see how these guys stack up to their respective competitors. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, shoot me a comment below. I'll do my best to answer it. And I'm going to keep catching up on some headphones and amps and DACs and all kinds of stuff coming. So thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time.